How to use Python to collect data from the web. A demonstration. In this demonstration, I will show you the basic steps of collecting data from an API and also scraping data from a regular website. There is a corresponding reference notebook in the Learn Python for Research repository, so make sure you have that open whenever you try to solve these types of problems. Now, I will show you two examples. The first one would be how you can collect data from a relatively simple API, and second, how we can scrape some data of a basic website. For this intents and purposes, I will be using and I'll be showing you the request HTML library. Some of these steps you could also complete with requests, but I'll just request HTML so that I can do everything with one package. So I import this. Usually you want to import HTML session. And then whenever you want to start collecting something, you have to go through the documentation. Now, let's say that what we'd like to achieve is we would like to get the current price of Dogecoin cryptocurrency in euros. Then we can Google around, and then in this case, I found an API that's available and free to use. And it's the Cryptonator API. So I can go and I can click on that link. And then that will tell me some of the documentation as to how I can use this API. So here we have some examples, and we see that if we run this, and we can actually check that if we were to go to this website, then we get some JSON returned to us, because that's what APIs do. And there is some things that go in here. Most notably, it says here is some reference to the type of cryptocurrency, and here is some reference to the currency. And then it shows us here some other things that we can apply to this, and we get the idea. Let's say that this is what we want to do, and we copy this example, and then let's just first mimic this example that they have in the documentation. So we say, okay, this is our API URL, specify that as such. Then anytime we would like to use a request HTML library, we need to specify a session. So we can do session equals the HTML session. And then we can do res equals session.get, and then we specify the URL that we would like to use in order to obtain the data. So then we can run this. And then if we were to show this variable, you can see that it says response 200. Now this response is a request HTML object. It's not necessarily a Python object. And we see here already that the 200 indicates that it was successful, because this is an HTML code that will indicate whether the request went through and everything had encountered no problems. Or if it's something like a 404 error, then you know that it was not able to find the page, or maybe it says, well, you've tried too many times, whatever. So now we can use this res object, and we can obtain a bunch of information out of it. So if we do dot, and then we press tab for the autocomplete, you can see that there's all this different stuff that we can get out of this. So let's say that we just want to get the status code. So then we can get the status code 200. So we can do something like, if status code is not 200, print a problem. And in this case, because the status code was 200, everything was fine, so we don't get that print. And then what we can do is, whenever we look at this, and you can do res.text, which will just give you the raw text of whatever is being returned by this request. That will show you already that if you're familiar with this, you see the curly brackets, and you see, okay, that seems to be JSON. So we can say, okay, request HTML, parse this as if it's JSON. Whenever you see this happen, whenever it says bound method, blah, 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 that means that it was a function, but you didn't specify brackets. So in this case, we have to specify brackets, and then we here now have a Python dictionary. So we can say that this is the Bitcoin USD dict. And then if we wanted to get the value out of that, for example, we could do ticker to get to the first layer, and then we can add a second layer to this, say price. And then we see that the price is about $9,500 US. Now let's say that we would like to get Dogecoin, and we know that the reference to that is DOGE, right here. Then what we now can do is we can essentially adjust this so that we do this entire thing again. But let's call this the API Doge URL. But then we're going to change this for Doge. And we're going to change this to euro, which is reference. So you can see this in the documentation as EUR. So then we do the same logic right here. Let's say we print all of this, but now we're using the Doge URL. Then you can see that now, because we changed the URL and with that we changed what we're looking up, we now got the ticker Doge and we got the euros, and now we see the price is less than 1 cent. This is kind of a typical thing. However, if you want to look up a whole bunch of different data, for example, we want to get a bunch of different crypto tickers, then having to do this and having to type this out every time is not super efficient. So generally speaking, you will end up writing some form of a function that will take some inputs take some parameters as input, and then it will automatically change whatever it's requesting from the API based on what you're giving to that function. So if we want to do that, and we just copy all of this stuff over, and let's say that we want to specify a new function that says get crypto price, and then we say ticker. Then we can wrap all of this into a function, and then we can specify here, and you can do this depending on the type of API. You might have to specify this as parameters, but in this case, it's all just hard encoded into the URL, so we can just change this. So we use some basic variable and string syntax. So then it's going to take that ticker from the function, it's going to put it here, it's going to replace this curly brackets with whatever that ticker is. And we can name this something a little bit more general. Then we get it, and then we can say, well, if that is the status code is not 200, then maybe we want to return like a problem occurred. So then we know later on, if we look at what this function returns, we know whether it was successful or not. And then we say else, just continue with what you wanted to do. And we could just return this whole thing. So then if we were to run this, then we can see we now don't have to specify all of this. So if we want to change it to, for example, so if we want to change this to Bitcoin, we just have to change this, and then it worked that way. Now we could say, well, we don't want to retrieve this entire thing. Maybe we just want to get the price. So what we could do is we could specify here, saying we want to get ticker, and then we want to get price. So now anytime we run this, we get the price, and we don't have to get that out of the dictionary every time. And then it also asks to do that for Ethereum, which is ETH. So just make sure that works, and that also works. So that's kind of a typical example for an API. You would generate a function that would take some inputs, and then you would use the function to parse everything so that when you pass it into the API URL, everything will work fine. And then you process whatever it returns, and then you make that return, or make that return into function, and then you're good to go, and you can incorporate it into your code. The second example that I would like to show you is a basic web scraping example. So let's say there's no API available, and we have to resort to collecting data from a website. So the example here is, let's say we want to get the latest news for the homepage of the Seattle Sounders, which is the Seattle Soccer Club. Then we can go to that website, and we can see here that it says latest post. So for the sake of it, let's say that our goal is to get these titles so that we have a little bit of a sense of what the latest news is. Now we can do this with the request HTML library as well, but remember, we know the URL, so we can do that. We can use the same logic we just applied and get the Sounders fc.com website, retrieve that using request HTML. But because we now have to parse the HTML as well, we also need to find the CSS selectors so that we can reference to whatever we want to retrieve out of this website. So if we were to do this, we can specify the session again. And we say the Sounders URL is going to be this. And then if we were to do what we just did, now we have this response, but it's no longer a JSON, so we cannot say something like this, because then we get a decode error because it says, well, I could not parse this as JSON because it isn't JSON. And then if we were to do text, well, then we get the raw text, and then we all of a sudden have all of this to deal with. So we have to do that parsing step, and request HTML has that built in. So we can specify to say HTML. Now request HTML realizes, okay, we need to treat this as HTML, and then we can create a CSS selector and combine it with find in order to obtain what we want to find. Now, the way that we can do this is, and there's plenty of examples in the video and also in the reference material, is we can either use the Inspector Gadget Chrome extension, or we can use the Chrome DevTools. In this case, I'll show you with the Selector Gadget extension. Okay, so right here at the bottom, I now have this, and then I can just click on anything that I would like to be included in the CSS selector. You see I click here, and now, well, it is going to select all the links. So it's going to select a whole bunch of stuff. But then let's say, well, we don't want to get this. So we click that yellow item, and then it becomes red to indicate that that's not what we want. So then it's already getting better. We see here we now have 12 items selected. And most notably, we'll see here these 6 and these 6. But let's say we don't want the videos. So we click that again. And then what we're left with is just this one and these remaining 5 other yellow items. So now, okay, that got what we wanted. So then we go here, we click it, and we copy this. And we copy that into here. And let's just call this the our selector for the sake of it. And then we do res.html, and then we do find. And then we just plop that selector that we just got in there. And then we're going to run it, and then what is going to happen is request HTML parse this as HTML, and it's going to apply the HTML logic to find anything that matches that CSS selector that we just created. So we see that we now have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 things that are being returned. So that seems okay. So then we could say, well, these are our hits. And then if we were to pull out the first hit, you see that this is still not really going to be what we want. And the reason is that this is now going to return another HTML element that we can provide additional parsing on if we want to, or we can specify exactly what we want to get out of it. So for example, if we were to do .text, we're going to get the text out of it. So that seems good. If we're going to do .attrs, then what we get is we get a Python dictionary that has all of the attributes of that particular element. So if we wanted to get the link, for example, so that we could visit that page as well, we could do this. And then we could specify, well, we want to get that href, that link, and then we can get the link out of it. So then if we were to loop through this, and we can save it one way or another, but let's say 4 hits, and then we want to print the text. Then we now see that we have our different titles from our different news events. So you can see with the request HTML and the selector gadget library, this is not particularly complicated. Now, one thing I do see people do, and this is a little bit of a common pitfall, is that if you want to get multiple pieces of information, let's say we also want to get the date, is they would try to cram everything into one CSS selector. So they would go to the page, and you can clear this, and then they would start selecting things, and they would say, well, I want to get this title. I don't want to get this. I also do want to get this date. I don't want to get this. I also don't want to get this. But then you get something like this, which is just, it's very, very long. And as soon as your CSS selectors start to get very long, that generally is an indication that that's not what you should be doing. You'd be much better off using some of the logic of the page to find these different blocks of content, like this item, this item, this item, and then search within that item for the title and for the date. And the reason that this is better is because we don't have to deal with alignment issues. We don't have to deal with the fact that we have these very complicated CSS selectors that we might not understand, because we make it a 2-step rocket. And in that stage, in this first stage, we'll just get the kind of the news item. And then in the second stage, we'll get the details out of that. And that's just a way better kind of approach of solving that problem. So the way that we can do this is generally it's easiest to use the Chrome DevTools for this. So I would click or right click on this. I would click Inspect. And then I would get this little window down here. Make this a little larger. This much. And then you can see if I hover over this, it will select what I've got. Now, what I'm after is I'm after kind of this entire group of elements. So I can see here that I have row text, and then I get this, and then, oh, here, if I have this node or if I have this one, I have everything that I would like. So you can see, well, should I get this or should I get this? We could do either. But let's say that what we want is we're going to go with this list item. And this list item has a class that says post bean news item first. Now this first element, that's not going to work, but we can see here that when we go down the list, we have all these different items. So we see that everything with a class post bean news items seems to be what we're after. And then within that, there's an article, and that article might be what we want to get. So let's say we double click this, and we're just going to get this class, and we know that this is a li element. So then what we can do is we can say, well, res HTML find, and now we can make our own CSS selector. So we do li because we're looking for the li elements, and then we do dot because a dot indicates that we're looking for a class, and we're looking for this class post bean news item. So we can run this, and then voila, we see that now we have these other 6 items. Or even what we could do is if we want to save ourselves a step, we can do this arrow to indicate that we're looking for the item right after this, and that would be the article. So then we get the article so we don't have to go another layer deep. So we say, okay, these are our news articles. And then what we can do is if we look, for example, for this first one, and we wanted to get this title, then we can see here that there's a div that has a class that says node title, and then it has an H, or it has an A element in that has the title name. So we can say, well, look for a div that has a class no title, and then within that, look for a link, an H or an A element, and then get the text from that. So we want to do this for every news article separately, because that's the whole point of this exercise. So we say news article would be news articles, but then the first one, just so we can work with it a little bit better. We do find, and then we say, well, we want to get a div. And then within that div, we want to get the title. And within that, after that, we want to get that link element. So we can specify this. We see, okay, that's working. Because we know we only want to get one title out of every news article, we can say first. So then we don't have to get it out of the list. Saves us a little bit of hassle. And then we can say we want to get the text out of this. And then boom, we now have the text. Okay, so we got that title done. And then if we wanted to also get the date out of this, we can go back into this and we can right click on the date, click inspect. And then we see, well, there's a div that has a class that's called timestamp. And then that has the date as a text file or as a text element. So we can do the same logic. But then we're going to look for this one. We don't need to look for that href. So here we look for a div that has the class of timestamp within our news article. And now, boom, we have the date. So if I wanted to apply this logic to all of them, I'd just say for news article in news articles. And then boom. Say this. And then if we just were to wrap this, we can save it any way we want. Let's say we want to save this into news dict. Let's say make this a list. We can do something like this, where we say, okay, what we want to do is we want to create a news, let's call this a list so we don't get confused. Let's do the news list, news dict, specify an empty dictionary, and then we're going to add all of these to that dictionary. And we say this is going to be the title, and then the other one is going to be the date. And the way of doing it this way is convenient because we can very easily convert it into a pandas data frame later on. So we do this, and then at the end we say, well, append this dictionary to that list. We run it. It's going to run very quickly because it's only 6 articles. And then if we look at our news list, we now have a Python object that very neatly has our title and our dates. And if we wanted to even put this into a pandas data frame, it would be very easy because we just import pandas. And then we can just put this in here. And because of the way we formatted this, Pandas will automatically be able to figure out what the column names need to be and what have you. So we run this and we now have a nice Pandas data frame that has the title and the date, and we can convert this, we can analyze it, we can save it to an Excel sheet or whatever. And at that point in time, we don't really have to do any web scraping anymore. We've got everything into Pandas and Python, and we can continue with our analysis. So this should give you a good idea of how you would go about collecting data from an API and collecting data from a website.